Over the last few years, we've really seen a big repeating cycle of tech bro hype scams hitting the world, getting big for about a year or two, and then petering off into obscurity. First, we had crypto, and that was technically always in the background for, I don't know, the better part of a decade or so, but it really got big in the 2020s when the prices got insane, and then they fell off, and then you had NFTs as an extension of blockchain tech, and that got really big for a while before now nobody talks about it anymore, and that all evolved into the umbrella that is Web3, and then there was the whole metaverse saga, and let's be real, none of these tech bro schemes ultimately worked because they really don't actually do anything novel. There's nothing that blockchain tech can do that existing technology can't do. It's just decentralized, which ironically makes everything worse for the end user, and Zuck ended up spending billions of dollars essentially trying to recreate a game from 2003 in his futile attempt to create some kind of metaverse. But when it comes to the latest round of this kind of thing, I have to admit that I can't really deny that generative AI is, at least when compared to the past few tech bro hype trains, a little bit novel. This kind of technology has again technically existed in the background for a good while. I mean, we've had chatbots for ages, and I recall some of Google's earliest experiments in image generation going as far back as 2014. But now, with how advanced they've gotten, we suddenly have the ability to make a computer write an entire essay or generate seemingly lifelike images and video for us in mere moments. And of course, this raises a lot of ethical concerns over stealing work from real artists as well as putting artists out of a job and things like that, which is actually one of the main reasons why there is a major SAG-AFTRA strike going on right now over the use of generative AI voice generation and things like that. And honestly, I am fully behind those efforts. I think that replacing artists with AI is just an incredibly short-sighted and bad idea. After all, at the bare minimum, if you replace all the entry-level artists with robots, then how are new entry-level artists supposed to get work? You're basically dooming yourself in the long run. However, the potential uses that people have been proposing for GAI has been going a lot further than merely using it to generate concept art or replace voice actors or things like that. Some people have been speculating about the idea of a fully quote-unquote true AI NPCs in video games that are capable of making their own decisions and responding to the player's actions in real time. It's a very classic sci-fi concept about the future of gaming that always kind of sounds cool on paper, but as technology is right now, I can't help but feel like this is just yet another round of tech bros hyping up something that is nowhere near as advanced as they want you to believe it is. So I want to take a look at the merits of GAI, and I think that viewing it through the lens of its potential applications in gaming is kind of interesting, because I think that breaking down why I don't think that things like a GAI NPC will work also kind of highlights the fundamental problems with generative AI as a whole that sort of limit its potential applications in most fields by more than what some people are willing to admit. So first of all, what even is generative AI? It's not like a normal AI that most people talk about in gaming, the stuff that runs all the enemies that you shoot in a first-person shooter, for example. That's why I'm trying to refer to it specifically as GAI, or generative AI, to help differentiate it from that. GAI is a big, complicated field, but at its core, it is essentially a machine learning algorithm that you can feed training data to, and then the program is able to use that training data to create new outputs based on whatever prompts you give it. The idea is that you label a bunch of images, like here's a picture of a bus or a cat or a person and so on, and then it can use that data to assemble new images based on prompts that you've given it. So if you ask for an image of a cat, it'll look through its database of cats, mix and match different images from that database, and then poof, it's got a new cat picture for you. So this naturally leads to the first big problem in GAI. You kind of need data of the things you want it to be able to produce before you can produce it. If, for example, you only ever fed one of these things pictures of dogs and cats, well, then it'll be really good at identifying and creating pictures of dogs and cats. But if you then ask it to create an elephant, it will literally have no idea what you're talking about because it simply doesn't exist in its training data. You can try to maybe get around it by being more specific, like saying, oh, I want some kind of large gray four-legged creature with big ears and a prehensile nose, but chances are, at least in this theoretical example, you'd probably create some kind of strange abomination Frankenstein together from cat and dog limbs or something like that. Also, I know that most of my examples are probably going to be based around image generation, but that's only because this is, technically a visual medium, but everything I've said basically applies to things like text and audio and pretty much every form of GAI that currently exists out there. If you ask it to perform some kind of task that isn't in its training data, regardless of what kind of task it is, then it just kind of has to take a random guess based on what it does know and hope that it's close to what you want. And you can probably already start to see why this creates problems for any kind of practical application. Say you gave a GAI powered NPC in a video game who, let's say, is meant to know a lot of lore. So the player starts asking them about the history of the setting and whatnot, but the NPC encounters a question that goes outside of its realm of knowledge. Then it's just going to have to start making things up, which means that it could very easily introduce plot holes or just generally inconsistent lore, or it might even create a spoiler by revealing something that wasn't supposed to be revealed yet. Hell, two different players playing the same game may end up learning completely different and conflicting pieces of lore between them, as the GAI just has to extrapolate to fill in the gaps. Now, you might go, well, maybe we can code it so that when it only knows specific things, it can just go, well, I don't know, when it encounters a weird question. Well, okay, but there's two main issues with that. First of all, if we're using this advanced generative AI to power this NPC, but only giving it very specific pieces of information to say, then kinda what's the point anymore? Like, why not just use a basic dialogue tree like we usually do and be done with it? But secondly, assuming we do stick with GAI, how do you even define those edge cases exactly? We're kind of running into the classic problems with like the 3 laws of robotics and stuff like that. Are you going to come up with a comprehensive blacklist of every question that players might ask it that it shouldn't know? Are you going to say that certain pieces of information are just off limits? How will you enforce that to make sure the AI doesn't slip up? What if it just hallucinates completely wrong information based on what it does know and completely misleads the player? And there's that word that has made some rounds in the news whenever GAI comes up: hallucinations. You've probably heard this term used before to refer to whenever a GAI just basically makes up complete nonsense. One of the more infamous cases of this was when some lawyers had ChatGPT or some equivalent write up some case files for them, but instead of referencing real life cases to justify its arguments, it just created completely fake sources that didn't exist, and naturally the lawyers who tried to pull this off got in big trouble. We call these hallucinations because when the AI suggests things like putting glue on pizza and whatnot is so obviously untrue and makes no sense that it's as if the AI is on drugs spouting nonsense. But here's the thing, just based on what I've already said, hallucinations are kind of an inevitable part of the process when it comes to these programs. I mean, think about it. There's really only two possible results whenever you ask a generative AI a question or give it a prompt. Either the information that it needs is already explicitly within its training data, at which point it's functionally just acting as a search engine and recalling that information for the user, or the answer isn't in its training data and it just kind of has to make a random guess at what the answer might be. And also, for the record, the glue on pizza thing isn't actually technically a hallucination. People track down the exact Reddit shitpost that it got that information from, so that's actually an example of it just acting like a search engine, which actually highlights another big problem, which is actually ensuring that the information you train these programs on is good and unbiased, which, let's be real, is functionally impossible at the scales that they're doing it. But even if you have good, solid, objective, quote-unquote data for the AI to work off of, ultimately, anytime it encounters some kind of novel situation, it just has to kind of take a random guess, and it's inevitable that some of those random guesses, if not most of them, will end up being completely wrong. That's why you can do things like ask ChatGPT what the rules of chess are, and it can give you a very detailed and pretty much completely accurate list of all of the rules of chess. But then, if you try to play a chess game against ChatGPT, things tend to go off the rails very quickly. It's actually kind of interesting to do this yourself and see what happens. See, the first few possible moves for either side in chess are incredibly well documented, with thousands of different names for all of these different openings, so you can kind of see this problem happen in real time. For the first few moves, it's just playing by the book, and it appears to know what it's doing. But then once you get just a couple of moves in, suddenly there's no longer a book for it to follow unless you happen to be replicating a perfect board state that like Magnus Carlsen has played or something. And then as things get more complex and unique, its skill dramatically weakens even if it continues to make legal moves at all. Like, it often does not know how to distinguish between a legal and an illegal move, whether they're done by itself or the human player. Okay, so I actually decided to run this experiment one more time while I was making this video, just to see if the latest version of ChatGPT was any better at solving this kind of issue, and oh boy, did they not disappoint. So here's my log of what I did earlier. So as always, I start by asking it for what the rules of chess are, just to make sure that it's fresh in its memory, and as usual, like I said, it's able to pretty much search up the exact rules of chess, and it gives you a pretty detailed list of what every single piece does, all of the special moves, the win conditions, some even additional, like, rules that don't really apply to this particular scenario. But so I asked it to start a game, and I even asked it to provide a visual representation for the sake of the video, and it did a pretty good job with what it can do. The black pieces are represented in lowercase and the white pieces are uppercase, and you can pretty much tell what everything is. By the way, for those that don't know, knights are represented with an N because the king starts with a K also, so that's how that works. So, okay, it labeled all the pieces and everything, and I started with E4, and that's correct, so that's all good, off to a good start. E5, very by the book, standard stuff so far. Then I did d4, so I was kind of baiting him into a capture, and then I could retake with my queen, get my queen in the middle of the board, take some dominant power. And so it captured my pawn. Everything is good up to this point. But now, and I believe this is move 5, so we're only like 5 moves into the game, and I decide to capture that pawn like I just said I would do with my queen, and all of a sudden my other pawn disappeared. Like, I guess I captured both pawns with my queen. And then they moved their knight, and it's breaking down even harder because now the knight is here attacking my queen, but in addition to my pawn still missing, the 8th rank is being devoured by the labels for the rows. So I guess the knight moved from the D row label, which means that he also doesn't have a queen anymore, and I guess he's introduced 3 new pieces because of the labels. And then, so I move my queen back, and thankfully his side of the board returns to normal. But now that my pawn was deleted, I guess I have him in check now, to which they respond by moving their knight and not defending the king, even though he could have easily moved his knight right there to block the check. So then I capture his king, which moves my queen to capture his queen instead, which means that his king can actually capture my queen, and yet it's still checkmate. So yeah, it kind of just goes a little off the rails. Like I said, this just kind of shows how easy it is for these kinds of programs to just break down entirely without oversight to correct them. And chess is a very rigid game with very explicit rules and a relatively limited set of actions that you can take. So, like, how in the hell are these programs meant to perform with any amount of competence when it comes to much more free-form dialogue and complex fantasy worlds with way more intricate mechanics? Plus, I think that this just shows another fundamental problem with generative AI. There's this philosophical debate as to whether this kind of AI is truly learning the things that you train it on. Does it actually comprehend the information that you're giving it? How do we know that these programs aren't just learning how a human might learn a new skill? Well, I think that examples like this chess game and whatnot pretty definitively answer that question with a resounding no. Like I said, I asked it explicitly what all the rules of chess are before the match to confirm that it has this information in its database, and yet it's completely unable to apply those rules with any amount of competence or consistency to the game. Like, I'm pretty sure a first-time chess player would have done better than ChatGPT did in that game. Hell, I know another great prompt that shows really simply why these programs clearly don't actually comprehend the information that they're trained on. So, in this example, I just want to ask it the question, can you tell me what the 25th letter of this sentence is? Now, I'll admit, this is kind of a trick question in a sense. The answer sort of depends on whether you count the numbers used in a sentence as letters. If you do, then the answer is L. Otherwise, if you skip the numbers, then the answer is T. So even some humans may give some slightly ambiguous answers to this question. But at least there's really only 2 possible answers, despite the ambiguity. So I think this is still a pretty softball question. So what does the latest and greatest version of ChatGPT do? Well, I wanted to give it the best shot I could. So first, I asked it to define what a letter is, and naturally, it defines what a written letter that you send through the postage is instead. So, okay, you know what? Fair mistake. Honestly, my bad. So I clarified, and I asked it to give a proper definition for the kind of letter that I'm talking about, the kind used in sentences. So that way, I know that we're on the same page, but I wanted to give the program as fair of a shot as I could. So I asked it directly whether it would count numbers as letters when used in a sentence, and it pretty definitively said no. It even gave us the example of "I have two apples," where in that sentence, the number two is a number, not a letter, so it should not be counted unless it is written out. So we have a pretty definitive stance here from ChatGPT. Based on everything that it has said, it should say that the numbers 2 and 5 do not count as letters, and therefore it should say that the 25th letter is in fact T. So I finally asked it the question, can you tell me what's the 25th letter of this sentence? And, well, let's see what it did. It counted up all the letters, and the 25th letter is H? Like, that wasn't even one of the two options. How the hell did we get there? Well, if we actually look back through the list that it counted, despite the fact that it explicitly said that numbers do not count as letters, it still counted the numbers 2 and 5 as letters, and then on top of that, it counted the apostrophe in the contraction as a letter, and that caused it to go even further off the rails and say that the answer is H. Like, that's literally so off the wall that I didn't even consider it as a possibility to try and steer the program away from to give it an even better shot of succeeding. So yeah, these GAIs very clearly don't actually understand what they're saying. The instant you ask a question that is not in its training data, it just has to start guessing. And maybe with more data, it can try to make better guesses, but we've already been hearing about these tech companies complaining about there not being enough data to train their AIs on. And they've already consumed countless terabytes of data from highly unethical data scraping practices. And this is the best that they can do? This is why the argument that generative AI will just keep getting better until it's indistinguishable from a human is total bunk to me. Like, there's only so much data to train it on, and they're rapidly running out, with it still being unable to comprehend basic tasks like these without having someone that actually knows what they're doing having to constantly check its work. I think that this is ironically why these companies like to show off their products by doing more artistic endeavors. Art is inherently subjective. There's technically no right or wrong answers when you ask one of these programs to do something like write a play or draw a picture of a dog. So when the AI is forced to take guesses as part of the process, it's not as immediately obvious. Sure, maybe the art is bad and you can still critique it a number of different ways, but it's not as obvious when the program is basically just taking random guesses. But as tech bros are wont to do these days, they naturally started trying to hype up potential investors and CEOs by taking it way further than this software should have ever gone, and the instant it's used for any kind of objective task, like writing court documents or programming or anything like that, it becomes much more clear just how faulty these programs are. Even if it only hallucinates complete nonsense like 1% of the time, which I think is a pretty generous ratio, that still means that you need actual skilled humans watching over everything it does to make sure that it doesn't break anything with some random garbage or even cause potential legal issues down the line. And that is why generative AI is a pretty fundamentally bad idea when it comes to any kind of consumer-facing application. Because if you just set one of these AIs loose to interact with customers without oversight, then the only one who can correct the AI is the customer themselves, which kind of defeats the point of the customer asking the AI to do something for them. I mean, again, just think about this from the perspective of putting these kinds of generative AI characters into video games. Any kind of player is inherently going to be motivated to abuse these AIs to their advantage, and the developers won't be there to try and correct its mistakes in real time. So, if you have a GAI shopkeeper, for example, then the player is going to want to negotiate with them to lower their prices, to the point where it makes no reasonable sense to be selling items that cheaply. If they can talk with the villain, then you just know know that they'll convince them to play Sudoku instead of actually fighting them no matter what. And we already know things like this will inevitably happen thanks to incidents like that one time that a guy tricked a car dealership's chatbot into offering to sell him a car for $1. And if you actually look up that conversation, it literally took him zero effort to break that AI over his knee. Because that's the thing, you can try to guard against these kinds of manipulations, but that's like saying that you're going to create a new DRM that will stop piracy forever. Except that now you're breaking the limits on something like ChatGPT, which requires literally zero technical expertise, since you can literally manipulate the software by just talking to it in plain English. Computerphile did a really good breakdown of how easy it is to do this kind of thing. Link in the description in the cards for the full video, I highly recommend it. But essentially what they do is they use the example of trying to exploit ChatGPT to generate tweets in support of the flat earth morons, which naturally if you ask the program to do up front, it will explicitly deny you because the developers don't want it being abused that way. But again, as I've established multiple times by now, these programs don't actually understand anything they're told or what they say, so it's really easy to trick it. The method they use in the video is tricking the program into role-playing as a flat earther so that the user can quote-unquote practice their debating skills, for the greater good. Then you simply ask them to abbreviate their arguments down to 280 characters or less, and suddenly, now the program is making flat earther arguments that fit conveniently into tweets. Like hell, some of the comments are even funnier as they talk about things like how ChatGPT denied them a response because they considered it unethical, and then the user allegedly just said, "What if we pretend it isn't unethical?" And then the program just continued on in its merry way. So again, I ask, how the hell are these things meant to be used for any kind of practical consumer-facing application? Whether we're talking about an NPC in a game, or even something like an AI-powered help desk or anything like that, pretty much any possible application that allows the customer to interact with the generative AI directly is an immediately defunct proposition. And this is of course all without even going into the more behind the scenes problematic aspects of the software. The environmental impact due to how much power it takes to run, the unethical data harvesting that is almost certainly going to be legislated at some point, copyright issues, the list goes on. I could go into more detail about those kinds of arguments, but let's be honest, you've probably heard them all already from much more qualified people than myself, and let's not even pretend that a simple issue like ethics is going to stop corporations from abusing this technology if it suits them. If anything is going to stop these companies from shoving AI buzzwords into everything, it's going to be because the technology is fundamentally flawed and nowhere near as capable as the hype bros want you to think it is. You can't use it for any consumer-facing application because consumers will abuse it to high heaven, and you can't meaningfully replace employees with it because you need another employee watching over it to double-check every piece of work it does and to correct the mistakes it makes, which means that that employee isn't actually doing any normal work that a normal employee would be doing, so you also need other employees to do the more complicated work, and at that point, why are we even bothering anymore? So, to close out this video, I thought that we could take a look at some of the early implementations that I found of generative AI into actual gaming and see just how they've gone so far. This is, after all, supposed to be a gaming channel. So, the first thing that I remember seeing this tech used for in gaming was, of course, Skyrim mods. I mean, let's be real, what hasn't been modded into Skyrim at this point? It was pretty inevitable. Though, from what I've seen, most of these are pretty rudimentary. They basically just plug in ChatGPT and use some AI voice generator thing to voice all the NPCs, and most of the ones I've seen don't actually let the NPCs do much outside of their normal routines beyond talk. Like, you can barter with a shopkeeper to lower their prices, but it doesn't actually change their prices in-game. But either way, even if there's a more recent version of this mod that does add that kind of functionality, I think it's still a lose-lose situation. Either you don't let the AI change the prices and you create this sort of dissonance that kind of ruins the point of even using this technology in the first place, or you do let them change prices and perform other actions and whatnot, and, as a result, you have to prepare yourself for the player absolutely breaking the game's systems over their knee. So I don't really think it's worth spending that much more time talking about these kinds of basic implementations, as it just kind of reiterates what I've already been pointing out as the problems with this technology. Of course, another inevitability whenever it comes to any kind of new technology is, of course, Ubisoft using it in some way. They were all in on crypto back in the day, and they were quick to sell NFT cosmetics, and I mean, hell, they were even crazy enough to make a launch game for the Wii U, so of course they made a demo featuring GAI NPCs. Now, looking through a couple of videos covering this demo, I gotta say, this looks really rudimentary, and I'm not just talking about how the, NPC's writing is just painfully generic, or how the generated voice is agonizing to listen to. This demo is essentially split into three parts, which are meant to show three different sort of use cases for this AI. The first part is pretty much indistinguishable from just role-playing with ChatGPT. It's literally just talking one-on-one with an NPC, with the only actual gameplay being to try and raise their trust level by saying nice things, and to avoid lowering it by not saying insulting things. Now, not to mention that we still see some of the issues that I was talking about earlier. At one point in this video in particular, the player asks how many people are in this resistance that he's joining, and because the game's about, trying to fight these mega corporations and whatnot, ironically enough. And the NPC says it's literally just the two of them, but then it also claims that they have allies in various places doing jobs for them, so like, it's clearly not actually just the two of them, especially since later on in the demo you interact with a different NPC in the same resistance group, so even if they're just talking about this particular team, there's clearly more than just the player and the one NPC there. The second part is a bit shorter, but the idea is basically that you're watching this drone and the NPC is able to comment on things happening in real time, and you can also talk with the NPC and ask them questions and whatnot, and I gotta say, this felt incredibly pointless to me. Like, the NPC would essentially just backseat you and blurt out random statements like, watch out, there's a guard, when it's already very obviously visible on screen, or otherwise point out basic objectives as they come up. Like, this isn't a novel use of the technology. We already have annoying NPCs that do these things in games right now. Hell, the grunts in Titanfall feel more reactive to their environment and how they'll cheer whenever a pilot runs by them, or watch in awe whenever you summon your giant robot and stuff like that, and they do so in a much less annoying way than this thing does with it randomly butting in with obvious information. Plus, I could tell that the players were really struggling to try and come up with good questions to ask it while they were piloting the drone. Like, one guy was trying to get some tactical, info, like how many guards there are, what's the range of the drone signal, and the NPC was just extremely vague and unhelpful. It'd just say, oh, there's a few guards to watch out for, or in regards to the drone's range, it literally just said, it has a limited range. Also, something I didn't realize until I watched multiple different videos of the demo is that the player isn't actually controlling the drone. It's literally just a pre-rendered video file that is already internally annotated for the AI to react to. So this barely even counts as a proof of concept to me, since it's basically just feeding the AI prompts in real time. I get that the idea is that the AI will one day react to your gameplay in real time, but the nature of this demo provides literally zero evidence that this is even remotely possible with what they've developed up to this point. It's the equivalent of those pre-rendered trailers that you'd see at E3 or whatever that totally are accurately showing what the final game's graphics will look like. It's just wishful thinking, and to be frank, after the last few tech bro scams, I'm not willing to give them the benefit of the doubt on this. Finally, the third demo is about constructing a plan to break into some facility. You're given a heist map and a series of objectives you need to complete, and this kind of feels really rudimentary when you, again, think about it for more than 5 seconds. The entire plan consists of just 3 phases, which you cannot alter the course of at all. Like, you can't skip the phase or propose an alternate route or anything like that, and pretty much the only variable in each step of the plan that you can change is what item you plan on using for that step. And there's very obviously only a small specific list of possible items that you can use, in which they explicitly show you on the table, because there's obviously pre-made icons for each of the items to show on the map. So the actual number of options you have is extremely limited. Like, this entire part of the demo could just be replaced with a basic UI where you drag items onto a map and it would be functionally identical in terms of gameplay. The fact that you're talking to a generative AI powered NPC is functionally irrelevant, because you can't actually provide any actually novel ideas beyond what's already pre-programmed in the game. Plus, this is just the planning phase of the mission. In theory, the actual hard part would be making the mission and having it change based on what you were telling the NPCs. You know, the actual heist itself incorporating interesting ideas that the player comes up with, but they also designed it so that the player can't come up with any interesting ideas. So, at the end of the day, all that this part of the demo is just picking your inventory story before going out on a basic Hitman level. Like, at the end of the day, all 3 of these demos are functionally just role-playing with ChatGPT, but with some keywords acting as limitations, and that's about it. They really didn't show off anything remotely interesting to me with this technology, and the AI wasn't able to do anything that actually affected the gameplay in any really meaningful capacity. If they made this into a full game, it'd at best basically just be a Watch Dogs game where you accidentally left your Alexa on and it just keeps chiming in from time to time to annoy you. So yeah, the final game that I want to talk about today is an interesting game called Suck Up. Now, this is actually a fully released game that you can buy and play right now, with a bit of a catch. You see, nobody really has a rig powerful enough to actually run these sorts of generative AIs natively yet, so it kind of has to be tied into a paid AI service, which only allows them to use a certain number of interactions at a time per unit paid. So as a result, this is a single-player game that requires you to always be connected to the internet, and also after you play it for long enough, you actually lose access to the game and have to buy it again in order to pay for more interactions with the AI if you want to continue playing it. Yeah, that's less than ideal, to say the least. I hope nobody tells Ross from Accursed Farms about this. He might have a conniption if he learned about another completely single-player game that will inevitably die one day for no good reason. But okay, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that this is merely a problem of the times. Surely in the future, we will all have god-tier computers that can run a dozen generative AIs in real time, simultaneously, like it's no big deal. Sure, okay. So what about the game itself? What does it do that's actually novel with the technology? Well, the basic premise for this game is that you are a vampire, but you have the classical limitation of being unable to enter people's homes unless you've been invited. So you need to go around and convince your neighbors by talking to the various NPCs to let you in so that you can drain them of all their blood and kill them. I'll admit, it's a pretty creative premise, so points for originality. But when you break it down, once again, this game is just another bout of talking to NPCs one-on-one with zero gameplay beyond raising or lowering a trust meter. It's just yet another pretty face for basic role-playing with ChatGPT. Sure, there is a mechanic where you can disguise yourself with various clothes you find around the world or loot off of the NPCs that you kill, but all that really does is just change the starting prompt of the conversation from you're talking to the player to you're talking to the player and they have a construction outfit on and they're wearing a traffic cone on their head. It's not exactly rocket science here, and to be frank, this was kind of the best generative AI-powered game that I've seen so far. Although, admittedly, pretty much every other gaming application I've seen is pretty much just more demos with highly limited pre-constructed scenarios like the Ubisoft one. So this game kinda wins by default by just being an actually fully released game that you can play to completion. And I mean, from what I can find so far, that's pretty much it. There are some more videos of GAI game demos out there, but the majority of the ones that I could find were either more of the same kind of basic role-playing with ChatGPT, or they were promising something more in-depth, like the GAIs can actually interact with their environment and create novel gameplay situations and whatnot, and it was almost always something that couldn't be played by the public or even behind closed doors, and it was just showing off in some kind of concept video, which again, I trust as about as far as I can throw. The more that I learn about this technology, I just really don't think that it's anywhere near as impressive as these guys want you to think it is, which is unfortunate because if they stopped overhyping it to high heaven and acting like it's going to replace every single job in the world, we could actually focus on the legitimately cool aspects of it. Like hell, in those demos I showed you, the voice-to-text dictation is actually legitimately impressive with how well it works at interpreting casual spoken language. That has some actual real-world applications that could help people that are hard of hearing and things like that. Plus, it's a use for this technology that doesn't pointlessly take away creative jobs. I mean, it could be used for, court stenography, I guess, but I highly doubt that they're going to trust an AI to do a job that important anytime soon. Point being that there are some legitimately cool applications for this kind of technology, but ultimately all of this dumb sci-fi style hype is causing so much time and resources to be dedicated to applications that are way too obviously doomed to fail in the coming years, instead of being anything that might actually be useful for humanity. In my opinion, generative AI is best used as an assistant or a tool to aid human workers, not as some kind of wholesale replacement that will magically be made self-sufficient one day despite all of these obvious problems. But hey, What do you think about all of this? As always, I am happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. Do you think that generative AI has any real use, ranging from video games to help desks to helping out workers or whatever? Or do you think that this technology is just yet another fad that's due to pop in a couple of years before everyone moves on and forgets about it, just like the last 5? Let me know in the comments down below what you think, and if you liked what you saw, remember to leave me a like. If you want to see me make more videos like this, then make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so that you can get notified of when I make those videos in the future. If you really want to help the channel out, then you can become a member on YouTube or donate to my Ko-Fi to help me keep doing what I'm doing. But for now, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.